Welcome to the Centurion Response podcast, where we speak with faithful business leaders about their experiences following Jesus at work, at home, and in their communities.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Centurion podcast. Not the voice maybe you're expecting if you were in the last time. However, we're just kind of flipping the script. We were talking through things previously, and we're like, hey, what if we did this together? What if we kind of joined forces? Had a co-host and a co-host. I'm not sure which one of those, first or second one I am, but joining Pete. And today we figured, hey, how about we did Todd being interviewed last time? How about we flip the script and let's interview Pete, get his story. And so that's where we're going today. So, Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Todd. Good to still be here.
So, I want to. I'm going to change even what we just talked about beforehand. I want to get. Why did you want to do the podcast first, and then I want to get some background on you. So where'd the idea of the podcast come from? Because it's obviously your idea.
I care most about capturing the stories of people who are doing things in response to God, and I think that those stories, one story begets another or speaks faith. And so you've got ideas like the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. And so when one expression of what God has done is shared with somebody else, it gives permission for somebody else to say, I want that too. And so within the podcast, what I want to do is talk to people who are responding. So the centurion is the idea of the leader who goes to Jesus on behalf of the people he leads. And whether or not the people he leads know anything about that is irrelevant. It's the connection between the leader and Jesus. And so what I want to do is capture stories of people who are doing that and what's that experience like. From a business development side, I think a certain portion of the people that I speak with will end up saying, I want help either with my brand or with a platform or with my family. But I'm only looking for a handful of clients. And so really this is about capturing the stories of what people are encountering with God.
So for those who aren't familiar with the story of the centurion to Jesus, tell us that story. What is that one about? Why that story about all the stories in the Bible?
Well, so there's a Roman centurion who has a servant who's paralyzed, and he's part of an occupying force, but he can't help. And so he goes to Jesus in hopes that Jesus can help. And part of what stands out in the story to Jesus anyway is that Jesus responds to the centurion's request, like, let's go take care of it. And the centurion says, you don't even need to come. I too lead people who do what I command, and I know that that's how you work as well. So just say the word and it will be done. And Jesus is struck by the centurion's faith. And so part of what I see in that is the centurion has a sense of duty and obligation to protect that paralyzed servant, and will go outside of his normal comfort zone and certainly outside of his own power. And in that, there's a certain piercing of self, that the burden he has for the person he's leading is bigger than himself, and he's willing to confess that. And so he goes to Jesus, who has a power outside of himself to flow down in hopes of blessing. And so there's this humble posture that's in there. And I think that a good leader allows himself to be broken by the duties, but also the needs of the people that he sees around him. So there are only another couple of instances where you've got people similar to that servant. So one of them, a group of friends, lowers a paralyzed person through the roof down to Jesus. So you've got friends who offer somebody down. You've got another instance where nobody helps, but Jesus comes, and that's at the pool of Bethesda, where Jesus shows up and heals the man. And then the other thing that would be parallel to that would be when David, for sake of honoring Jonathan, seeks out Mephibosheth and invites him as a family member of
Wait, how do you say that last name? Jonathan?
Never said it correctly twice.
It's the hardest name to pronounce in the whole Bible.
That's right. And so in that instance, that is for the sake of one friend to another, there is a gift extended. I think that all of those are really interesting dynamics about why does one person seek the well-being of another. I think in our time, more business owners and more leaders it'd be more appropriate for more business leaders to do that. And I see that there's a trend in that direction. I think that I'm sure at some point we'll end up talking about kings and priests in here. But what I see is I keep meeting business owners who understand that they have a paternal burden. They have a sense of responsibility for the people they lead. They know they need to pick up the tab for the people they lead, and they know that the first fruits of their operation and of their life have everything to do with the father's desire to be reconciled with his children. And so what I want to serve are people who have a centurion's burden, but then a centurion's response, where they're going to go to Jesus on behalf of the people they lead. So my desire is to see more success happen for more people who take that approach more frequently.
I love that. And at this moment, I am very much distracted by over your left shoulder is a really weird picture.
The one on the wall, or
yes, no,
yeah.
the one on the wall, the dude with the striped shirt. I
Yeah,
guess just
I need to find better looking
poor
friends,
choice.
but I work with what I can.
To tease that out of why I wanted to just make fun of it. You have photos all over your wall. So if we were to pan the camera to the left, there are photos of 30 people on this wall. And on the right shoulder, there's that, whatever, east, west, south, we'll call it that wall.
The other wall. Yeah.
The other wall. Photos as well. Again, it's this theme of story, of getting to know, because I think personally, and again, we've known each other long enough to know several iterations of career and calling and how do we live this out. And you have more throughput than I do. Mine's like, woo, gee, woo. Yeah, it just kind of, I skip around more, apparently. You have a throughput of story more, it seems, of either getting to know people's story or even helping them tell their story, which I think is crazy cool. For me, you are one of the more insightful people. Like when you tell me an introduction, other people are like, hey, well, he does this, he does this, he does this. They kind of describe job and career, maybe kids or something. You are like, well, you should meet this guy. He views Legos, like sin, as a Lego to be removed from his back rather than something ingrained within his soul. I'm like, that's the coolest intro ever. I feel like I know him. What's the deal with story? Like, why? You teased before this idea of when we tell our stories, it gives people permission. I want to unpack that idea more, and what about story is so intriguing to you, / why do you want to help tell them? Walk through that. Why is story so important to you?
Yeah. Well, the pictures are on the wall because there are people who either intentionally want to be reminded about my desire to see blessing come to them, or they have a story, or they feel like allies. It's kind of the same reason people keep books on their bookshelves, is they feel like allies and friends that
I do it to look important. It makes me look smart.
What's weird is that you could buy a poster of a bookshelf like that. So I think that it goes all the way back to root for me. So I've always struggled with the Westminster Catechism question of what is the chief end of man? And the answer in that catechism is the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. While that's not incorrect, I think you can't start a question about creatures or creation by asking about creation. I think a far better question would be, why would God, who existing in three persons, full, complete, delighting, joyful, lacking nothing, why would God create anything in the first place? And so I think that the answer to that is, and this is a quote, Richard Sibbes was a Puritan theologian, but he talks about God delights to spread his goodness. And so I think the reason we exist, and it's the same reason when I think about my kids, like my kids do not exist for my glory. I think the idea of, in the end, we glorify God, and it is to his glory that we exist and that we have a relationship with him. But a God who is already full, complete, creating something for his own glorification strikes me as a profoundly masturbatory assertion. Like you're just doing this why?
Like, you used a big word I don't understand.
Masturbatory? Yeah, well, look it up. I mean, I think that is God being gratuitously self-focused, and that makes sense to us because we want to be seen as objects or whatever. I don't think that's how God works. I think my kids exist, and I think we exist because my wife and I have this relationship, and we just thought it would be awesome to know them. We made all sorts of promises to them before they were born. My kids exist because I wanted to meet them. I wanted to love them, and it was the right thing to do. God spreads his goodness. God creates new things to take delight in them. He just thought it'd be cool to know us. And then our relationship within that, we get to spread his goodness. And so I think that's at a meta level why we exist. Within that, I look at the relationship within the Godhead. And so, like Augustine describes the Father as the lover, the Son as the beloved, and the Spirit as the searching love that reveals them to one another. So there's this embrace between Father and Son, and we get to live in that embrace. We're invited into that space between them. And that's it, kind of the same way as my kids live in the embrace between my wife and I. And so the stories are there for that. When I then go to Revelation, it talks about the brethren overcome the accuser by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And there's this assertion that these are the two weapons. And somehow testimony rests comfortably and seemingly with equal power next to the blood of the Lamb. And at first that feels like a tremendously heretical thing to say, that anything could have the same power as the blood of the Lamb. The problem, I think, is that we've made testimony a really cheap sales pitch, a shill thing. It's about us rather than about him. Yeah. But when you do a word study on testimony, it starts off, the first time we see testimony is when God writes the law on the tablets. And so the testimony is the tablets. And so if you look at the recipe for testimony, it ends up being God plus you plus his law in your life. And so you've got the tablets, and then you've got the ark of the testimony, you've got the tabernacle of the testimony. And anytime you see these things brought together, you also see fire going with it. So you've got a small flame between the angels, you've got the pillar of fire. And then if you zoom forward to Pentecost, now we've got tongues of fire on the people when the law genuinely moves to our hearts. But it was just a recent prayer moment where I was struggling with, I like the permanence and the idea of God. I understand the idea of me, but the law part felt rigid. And so what he highlighted in the prayer was, it's not the law written on your heart. It's not like there's some foreign language scrawled in stone or flesh like a tattoo. It was, I am written on your heart. It's I replace your heart. And in that sense, Jesus becomes our heart. We have his heart. And so then the recipe becomes Father plus you plus Jesus. And so as we live in that place, presence takes on a different meaning. And from that presence comes how we walk in this world from an identity that we are between the Father and the Son. I realize I'm going way long and way theological.
But great.
But the idea is that our stories, our Jesus stories, and ultimately our testimony is about our experience with the presence of God as manifested by this living in the embrace between the Father and the Son. And when I think about what drives the Father, I think it's desire. He has something he wants to export into the world. He creates, and for the sake of this delight. And when I think about what motivates the Son, it would be longing. So desire and longing. One is export, one is a desire to import. And we get to live in that place in between. And so when you think about the Father's desire being reconciliation of the family, and the Son enduring death on the cross for the joy set before him, there's this longing for this joy set before him. We've also got moments where he's talking about Jerusalem, how I've longed to gather you to myself, and all this sort of stuff. I think the joy set before Jesus is the look on the Father's face as the effort works. And so when we get to live in that, for me, the hardest part is I see the vision where things go. And so like Centurion Response, I call it a vision casting studio. And my focus has to do with how does the kingdom show up in people's lives, in their stories, and then in the businesses and the expressions of presence that they navigate. There's this longing for the thing to be existing, and then there is this, we can reach too far and get ahead of
Yeah.
ourselves. The hardest part is to wait for a thing that you know is going to happen. A thumbs up on that. It's a feature.
Can
Not
we
my
do
favorite
this?
feature.
We'll
It's gonna work.
start.
It'll work.
Yeah, we'll start throwing features out.
So anyway, for me, story ends up there we go. Story ends up being about Jesus's expression in our world, and the thing that has the most power, and I think is the rustiest weapon in the kingdom, is the spiritual weapon of testimony. So I'm excited about that, and then highlighting for clients and friends and people I just encounter.
So
did you see this presence?
Pete, let's go way back then. So you're a local to Indiana. You grew up which high school?
Zionsville High School. We lived in Indianapolis several times. Dad worked for Lilly for his whole career. So
and here. You started literature as a focus early on, right? You've always liked writing. You've always liked story. Going not way in the Wayback Machine, but you've got a couple of books, which are awesome. I just wanted to highlight. That's what I grabbed on the shelf. In case you're wondering
what you were doing. Yeah.
We have, I like this one, the title, Learning My Name. I want to dig on that one. And My Beautiful Idol, which the artwork on these are just really curious and draw you in. But Learning My Name, walk me through this one. Why the name?
Because I think that, well, it ends up having to do with identity. And so the question for me is, well, what do you call yourself? What do you live as though God's pet name for you is? And so for a long time, so for me, the pet name was dumbass, not stupid, but clumsy. And there was a, guy joking, kind of pulling the pigtails, kind of joking dumbass.
Yeah.
So at one point, I remember I was living in Denver, but I was considering becoming a missionary in Syria. I mean, that would have been a really good fit, right? But my friend at the time, he was like, well, you'd put the dumbass in Damascus. And so that was a running joke for a long time.
Thanks, friend.
Yeah, he was helpful that way. And for a long time, I had this idea that that was God's pet name, and he liked to kind of tease me that way. And then there was a day where he just shut that down. He's like, I don't call you that. And it was, so stop it. Because when you joke that I call you dumbass, you're lying and you're cursing yourself, and it's not true. And it took a long time for me to actually come up with the question of, well, what do you call me? I just heard sorry. And he calls me sweetheart. And there's nothing macho about that. I'm sweetheart. And, in on different days, Tuesday stuck in traffic, Friday, before I was married, that whole Friday feeling profoundly single and unwanted. There were different names. And the idea in the end, I think, is can you dwell in the name he has for you? Can you dwell in the identity he has for you? And I'm really good at dodging that. And so that's what that book was about.
Well, I think we all are, right? There's so many ways to unpack that. So you went from writing some books, right? We have that skill set. This is my summary of what you do, and I'll let you explain it. But my summary is you go in and just walk around people's stories, get to know who they are, find the uniqueness, this insight, it's a, I think, therapeutic process, even just listening and understanding and being with them in a way that I think you're uncannily, characteristically awesome at doing that. And then putting those words into print for them is this cool process. But there's only one aspect of what you're doing at the Centurion Studios, right? Is you're walking through story, primarily with, how do you describe the clientele? What does that look like, the memoir writing kind of side?
Well, it ends up being, I had to make a choice about who to focus on. And that's where the centurion and the kind of the business owner or the CEO became the focus, because the burden there is different. And so it's the idea. I think in our previous conversation we talked about being slapped awake by the reality of heavy is the head that wears the crown.
Yeah.
And until you own and operate and lay in bed aware of how your decisions are going to impact families over time,
Yeah.
you don't have to be slapped awake to it. If you're a manager, you can care a lot, but it's a different sort of burden.
Yeah.
And so for two reasons. One, the price point, I can charge more, and that allows me to focus more deeply. But also the people who have the money to charge more can accomplish more because they have the resources to accomplish more. So part of it is the caliber of the burden, but then I don't know. I think the work is a rare kind of work. There are a lot of agencies that can do a lot of brand stuff. And so for me, it was a fit to go. I followed the CEOs home. I was already serving them doing brand stuff. And then as I got to do a couple of memoir projects, I just saw that, man, who my heart breaks for are the ones who carry a very heavy burden. Those families, those profoundly affluent families who are remarkable because of their last name and the thickness of their wallet, the pressures they face, they don't get to have ordinary pressures. They have just performance pressures that become really warping in their isolation. And
So I look at that as like a Joseph helping Pharaoh interpret his dreams kind of a setup. Do you identify with that story going like, it seems like you're a Joseph. You come alongside the Pharaoh and he's got these dreams and has no clue what they mean. And you're like, hey, tell me your dreams. Let's get to know you. You walk around in the story and you're like, I think it means this.
yeah, I look for, and as opposed to dreams, I watch for what I call them as talisman moments or talisman symbols. So most people remember the National Geographic picture of the Afghan woman with the green eyes.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that if the right photographer followed you through your life, there is one snapshot that would be the decoder for who you are and who you've always been. And if we can have that moment held up to us, I think I don't know if people ever find it on their own, but
Hmm.
there's I have my dad. I have a mortar and pestle on the bookshelves over my shoulder that my dad's mom kind of decided that he should be a pharmacist. She had decided that her eldest son was going to be a doctor, her middle son was going to be a minister, and then my dad was kind of steered towards being a pharmacist. So she liked that. And she liked that she could give statues for Christmas gifts of here's a doctor, here's a minister, here's a pharmacist.
Eh,
Um, and when my dad left the hospital pharmacy to go to work for Lilly, he became just a salesman. And
hmm.
my grandmother was disoriented and disappointed. My grandfather, his response was, you got to do what you got to do. But it was not an affirmation.
Hmm.
And my dad has lived, so this mortar and pestle is a talisman about his world that had to do with choosing his own way and then paying the price, I suppose, of not feeling affirmed or accepted or whatever. He had to, a weird sort of rebellious thing.
Yeah.
There are there's another piece of art. There was a client who learned to ride a bike on a bike that was so much too big for him that he had to put one leg under the crossbar to the far pedal. And if you want to understand how he sees the world, that bike explains it. The bike was the dare, was the invitation, and is an expression of the tenacity that he's brought to everything in his life. I think what I watch for isn't dreams so much as they're just these markers where I see in a person, here's an expression of your identity. Here's an expression of you as you rest transparently between the Father and Son. Here's how you show up. Here's how the light passes through you. And that tends to be the thing. So like there was a masonry restoration client who,
Okay.
so he fixes chimneys and bricks and foundations. And I made this little ad for him that was a chimney in a field where the rest of the house was gone, the rest of the cabin was gone. And the headline was, "Few things in life reward you for the effort you put into them. Those things are worth doing right." And, it was a simple way to talk about spend the right money on your masonry work.
Right.
Well, this burly dude who every time we shook hands, this is a guy who's worked with bricks his whole life. Like, he is a hand crusher, burly, tough guy. He just started crying. He's like, "That's why I do what I do." And it was this, I was just trying to help him sell his stuff. But we all have a chord that when it's strummed, we make sense.
Yeah.
So that's always been a passion. That's why. So Victorian literature business minor, it was, if you can make a whole book on why will Mr. Darcy ask her to the dance, what you're looking for is something to make your ordinary life mean more. And I think that's a big part of where the kingdom makes things matter.
I love that. All right, I've got two ways I want to go, and I think this is the first one. But you made let's jump into prophet, priest, and king a second first, because that would make it make sense. Biblically speaking, there's kind of these prototypes: prophet, priest, king. You've kind of riffed on this before. I want to dive deeper into that.
So
what do those mean, and what's the significance?
Yeah, I would say that if you do them more as poles or cardinal directions, king is opposite or opposed to and complementary to priest, and that prophet and teacher or sage, there's something more, shepherd, I guess, would be the opposite. So those, I think, are two separate conversations. What I look at right now with curiosity and frustration is more about the king and priest thing. So I think the job of a king is to plan, to protect, to grow, and to steward. So I picture a walled garden, and the job of the king is to lay out the footprint of that garden, to protect the wall, and then to facilitate the growth and life that can happen within the garden. They're future oriented. A king who runs out of money because of exuberant generosity has kind of failed his duty in some ways.
Mm.
A priest, on the other hand, has no inheritance, lives at the point of mercy, lives within that garden, and the job of the priest is to point out, where is life, where is the Lord within that garden. And so when I think about how that's supposed to work, there are these three tithes in the Old Testament, right? And so the first tithe has to do with whose we are, and that first tithe is to give to the priests who have no inheritance. It's the Levitical offering. I think in church settings, what I see really commonly right now is the priests who don't plan, who get to leverage mercy, who end up often leading not from the sort of responsibility that a king would, have driven kings out, and then being wired to be priests, they end up living right where the suffering happens, but they've driven away their allies. And their allies, the kings, have chosen to abdicate. And I think this happens at congregation by congregation level, but I think it also, I don't know if it was the Johnson administration where it happened societally, where we went from having a sense of civic responsibility and duty, and that's why you've got Baptist Hospital this and St. Vincent's that. But then when the government came in and said, we're going to do this thing, it's kind of like the Christians said, cool, mission accomplished, and they didn't go pick another fight. And so there's an abdication that happens. And I look back to the Emperor Julian persecuted the Christians because nobody was using his welfare system, because the Christians were taking care of everybody. And when you think about, little has changed. So the emperor needed the plant foot traction of having the people need him. And when the Christians were taking care of the people, a different kingdom had a different power and authority, and that was unsettling to the emperor. I think little has changed. And I think that when kings abdicate, tyrants who are not Christian kings fill that spot. And so I get frustrated now not with the priests and the church people who are they're being true to who they are. What they're missing is the kings and allies who are good at the stuff they're not good at. So, and this shows up in why the workplace ministry stuff makes so much good sense to me. That I think if you run a successful business and you generate these profits and you give a chunk of it to the church, you have to do so many things well and right in your business, and you have to create thunder, and then that produces results, and you give it to the church, and the church is really good at producing farts. It just doesn't have much impact. And I think it's because we flow it the wrong way. I think the better option would be, how do you invite ministers and ministry thinking and the whole agenda of how do you reconcile people with the Lord by serving them like a centurion would, whether or not you know this is a Christian offering that we have this service at work. How do you give people who are in a workplace blessings from God, and then does some portion of that flow back to a church? But the purpose of the church should not be self-sustaining. It should be pouring out. I think that's the nature of the Trinity. I think it's the nature of the kingdom, that anything the kingdom touches, it blesses, and that the kingdom is never extractive. I think that businesses tend to be more blessing and churches tend to be more extractive, and that it's the duty of kings to get good at getting things to flow the other way. So I think it should be kings invite priests in rather than priests trying to recruit kings to come to their church.
That paradigm changes quite a lot, in my opinion. And I agree wholeheartedly. When the priests and the prophets show up in the kingdom, there's a different positioning how they come. I don't know if I shared this story last time, but when I was a pastor, I had a sermon on generosity and several people fell asleep. And one of those guys became a client. One was yawning, like they were just not paying attention, whatever. Several months later, now I'm their financial planner. And I say virtually the exact same thing, right? About generosity and God owns it all and all these kind of things. And they just go, and they're just like blown away. I'm like, whoa, hold on. You fell asleep 6 months ago. What changed? Now, as their financial planner, I'm adversely affected by giving it away versus when I'm the pastor, I'm supposed to say this. So it was funny because I had both roles, and very odd to me, that dynamic, but very true. I think when the priest and the prophet get invited into the kingdom, it changes the paradigm. Like it's very fascinating. Related to that, I want to switch gears slightly, but you had a quote about a general who forgets the purpose of the army.
Well, I think this goes to the patriarch thing. Whether you're an employer or as the general, but I think it's made most sense to me in light of my family. And so the idea is that a general who thinks his job is to keep the soldiers safe has completely lost the vision for the purpose of the army. The purpose of the general is to equip and direct soldiers and the army to the right battles with the best chance of success to fulfill a mission. The job of my role within my children's lives is not their safety, nor their ongoing security after they leave home or whatever. My job is to put their hand in the hand of my Heavenly Father and to launch them into the world for the purposes of the kingdom. And that will include suffering, and it could include martyrdom. I mean, it's a thing. And if I aim for less than that, ultimately what I'm trying to do is steal back from God what is his. And when he says he's either the Lord of all or he's not the Lord at all.
Yeah.
And that includes my kids. And there's a whole bunch of the moment where that became possible for me. I remember my son Henry he was a baby. And I had in my head this fear of SIDS. And so I would, I'd give him his bottle and I'd sit in the nursing chair after I'd put him in the crib, and he'd be sleeping. And I would sit in this anxious vigil sort of way. And then there was a day where I prayed, I wanted to see his angel. I wasn't sure theologically whether that was a thing or what to make of it or whatever. But on this day, I saw the silhouette of his angel's shoulders and head, and it was this was this big warrior poet guy. So it was Hamish from Braveheart +2, And what I saw and was aware of was there was a hovering, loyal presence that had no other agenda but the obedience to God on behalf of my son. And he was a bigger version of me, a more dedicated and more capable version of me. And I said amen, and I got up from that chair and I walked out, and I never sat vigil that way again, including we've had some medical trauma moments that have happened, and I'm aware that that angel, but more than that, even the promise that I witnessed that day is true. I think we have to have those moments to be patriarchs, or generals who can launch people into harm's way in confidence of the Lord. It's the Isaiah 43, when you walk through fire, I'm there thing, and I'm gonna walk you through fire.
So related to that is this idea where we're trying to call men, instead of just being fathers, into patriarchs. Walk through. It's related to that. It's kind of the next step in the chain, it seems.
Well, I mean, I think, so if you start with boys will be boys, that never describes behavior that's good for anybody.
Right.
When a boy grows up and becomes a guy behavior is just as stupid. It's still football jerseys and fart jokes. Now, I like a good fart joke, and I like football, so maybe I just haven't grown out of this. But
You're in good company in that regard.
You move from it being a guy. I think you've moved from being a guy to being a man when wives point out that's a good man. And I think guys let guys get away with being guys. Men, they jerk the chain on it, if they're going to bother. I think most of the time men will just kind of quietly walk away and just be like, you're either worth pulling the chain, or you've just shown me what you're not. In the end, where I think that matters, it has to do with the struggle to, will I obey or will I find my own rationalizations out? I think that our enemy, we battle not against flesh, but against powers and principalities. So in that sense, we don't have any human enemies. All people then are either on the rescue list, so the people we're here to help, or they're on our specific rescue team. And so for me, what I'm looking for are, who are the people who, there are rescue teams, call them various levels of special forces quality or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so different rescues require different types of people, and different teams are built around different things. I want to be part of a rescue team that is serious and is willing to sacrifice and pay. And that's where the Centurion thing comes in. And I want to serve the Centurion. I don't have the same burdens. I don't think I have the same wirings or giftings. But what I want to do is be, like David's mighty men, the Gibberim, the ones who hear David whisper for a drink without water, and they say, "Your wish is my command," and then they're willing to go fight, die, kill for the water for their king. I want to be that kind of guy, and I can't be that kind of guy if I've got a guy. I can't be that kind of warrior and that kind of man if I'm just fart jokes and football jerseys only. So
I love it. So moving into the category of patriarch, which is an increased responsibility, an increased level of authority as well, but just a becoming a man, right? That's yeah.
Although it's not self-contained, it's this, man. If I could go somewhere else, I would. I'm working with a client right now who I describe as a mooring line with his company. So one arm is tied to a stone, and that's on shore, and the other arm is tied to his company, and he's this heavy rope, and there's only so far that a rope can stretch. And when that slack runs out, people fall off the boat because there's a drift that's going. It's strain in him. It hurts. And then he also then is really good at rescuing people from the water and picking up the tab and drying them off and sending them on their way, but they're no longer on the boat. He has nowhere else to go. And that willingness to stay put, is, I think that's where the patriarch thing happens, where it's, if I am undone, I am undone. But this is the promise that you've made, and this is like, this is what I have to do. This is obedience, and there's a breaking that goes with it. It's not that client, for as impressive as he is not more and more manly as he does this. He is less and less anything but the Lord's. So it's that pouring out part. Um, and I think trusting the promises, that takes a lot of work. And it's, in my experience, trusting the promises and the signs of the promises is way harder than coming up with my own schemes. And I think that's where the Centurion thing happens, where he has this commitment to this servant, and he's desperate. He's going to go find a solution.
All right, so we've kind of talked through the memoir deal a little bit. You also do, give me the other parts of what does the studio do.
All right, so
We've got
Centurion
memoir writing, but you're mainly branding, right? You said you've worked with the CEO and then follow him home. What is the work with the CEO part?
Well, so Centurion Response does three things. So it's vision casting for three core audiences that these leaders have. So it's for your company, your community, and your family. And so in the end, it's expressions of the same patriarchal burden or vision, and it's just packaged for three different audiences. So your brand has everything to do with how are you called to communicate the identity you have when seated in heavenly places. Now we're going super esoteric on it, but what's your job to import into the world? And that's what your company is here for. And then how do you measure the successes? And then what does your value prop look like? What is the driving virtue and vice of your organization? So where do you tend to find your greatest successes, and where do you tend to hide most readily? And I'm happy to unpack that a little bit further. Then the second category is platforms. And so that is, your platform would be your book or your TED Talk, or what's the thing that creates the halo effect for your brand, but shouldn't be done by your marketing department. So I need to find a better example than Tim Cook at Apple, because he wouldn't be a very likely client. But as a gay man, he could choose any progressive cause, and he would have an audience with that progressive cause. And that would be appropriate and in keeping with his personal brand, but it would be an unwise choice to spend Apple dollars on that, because it's choosing a market segment, and it's choosing something that might not be aligned with exactly what the business should be doing. So, but it would create a halo effect within a certain audience. The client I just referenced as the mooring line, the book there is about making your business belong to God. And then what does that look like? How do you measure it? What do you do? And what's happening in that instance is the entire vision for the company has been rewritten to include creating communities of faith. And so it's not just the work they do, but the mission that the entity has beyond itself. And there are a handful of companies that like the T Factor with Coca-Cola bottling, Hobby Lobby, some of these companies have missions beyond the company. So things can cross over. And then the last part is I call it private memoirs for prominent families. And so these tend to be people who are very, very private. They're talked about because of their prominence. And then the translation of vision to the family is challenging. Money creates problems. Prominence creates problems. Not to mention just the tension of, at work, everybody cares what I have to say and they do what I tell them to do. And I have to have a very different style at home, because frankly, most of these business owners would be way more. So Abraham talks about his son, Isaac. He named Isaac Laughter because we found out we were going to have kids, and boy, did we laugh. And the laughter is really cool because, Isaac's laughing on his face and Sarah's laughing, but then denying it because she's eavesdropping on it or whatever. But the self-referential name for that son is that's the product of a zealot. And a lot of these people are zealous, and a lot of them are willing to pay prices that their children have to pick up the tab for. And that's just part of the mix. It was in Isaac's best interest to have Abraham be Abraham and to be zealous. But Isaac is the only person who refers to God as the fear. He had some pretty rigorous camping trips with Dad, right? And so it's no surprise that his name for God is the fear. He's terrified. And Dad kind of made it that way. So how you package up the story, how you offer, I call them an apologia, so apologetics is I'm right, you're wrong, and I'm going to argue it, a legal case, or a theological argument. An apology is I'm sorry, please, I was wrong. Please accept me into your good graces. And then an apologia is simply a reason for the choice that you made. And so can you tell a story in an open-handed way that doesn't manipulate a response, nor does it ask forgiveness for a thing you shouldn't have to ask forgiveness for? So an example. My dad and I took just the two of us. We drove up to Canada several years ago when the talking GPS thing was a new service. And so it was from Indianapolis straight up. I think we crossed through International Falls. There aren't very many turns that you have to go through, but we had that GPS talking lady on. And so at every exit, at the next exit, continue straight on the road you've been on for the last 8 hours. And northbound, my dad and I were still settling in, and we let it play. But southbound, we'd had a week together by this point, and we were more relaxed. And he was playing Dad, so he was driving. And eventually, though, he got tired, and it was this big thing to let me drive with the boat and all the responsibilities. I'm 40 years old, but it's still, I'm still the kid. And so we pull over, switch seats, and as soon as I turn the car back on, I turn the GPS off. And he says, "No way," and he turns it back on. And we're, getting on the on-ramp, and I turn it off again. I say, "Dad, if I'm going to drive, we're going to turn this off." And he says, "No way." He turns it back on. So I drove 1 mile to the next exit, and in a moment of total German maturity, we switched seats again. So he's driving now, because I'm like, "No, I'm not doing it." And he'd already made the threat. I'd made the threat. We had to keep the promise of the threat. And so for the next 45 miles, we drive in silence, except for the sound of the talking GPS lady. And I think it was some sort of threat that this good week together would be soured by this experience. And I don't know that my dad had thought about why the GPS lady mattered so much to him. But then he offered his apologia. And he said, "As a young man, I wanted to be a pilot or an astronaut. Neither one of those things worked out for me. The GPS lady makes me feel like I'm in a cockpit or on the bridge of a spaceship." And he didn't say that he was wrong for having it, nor did he say that I was wrong for turning it off. He just said, "Here's why having it on matters to me." And I don't think he knew it before that. And that was an apologia. That was just a reason why, offered gently. And then we left it on, and that GPS lady became a really charming expression and a way for me to show love to my dad as a teenager. And what a gift. So when I'm listening to these stories, and they're almost all verbatims, you shouldn't care what I think about your dad, but if I can get your dad to tell stories that he's never shared with you in a way that matters, like the GPS lady, that's worth everything. And so what I'm listening for is the apologia and then that talisman. And it turns out that some prayerful listening makes those stories happen pretty easily. So those are the 3 categories.
I love it. So let's jump back into the podcast and kind of look to the future. Where are we going? Who are we going to interview? Why have a podcast? There's a million podcasts out there. Why do we need another one?
Well, from my perspective, all of these answers I'm giving have 30 years of me chewing on it, thinking about it, testing stuff out. And I don't feel like I communicate my own thoughts crisply, cleanly, efficiently. But I see the beauty of these realities all over the place. So what I want to do in these conversations is not have to unpack all of the theology, but to highlight and to maybe give a gift to people as we have these conversations about glints of heaven. How does heaven's light reflect in your world? And then can you see, here's another long answer. A Great Divorce from C.S. Lewis. There's a painter who has come up from the bus from hell, and the idea is that nobody's in hell who doesn't choose to be. And so these people from hell are brought up on a bus to these green fields of heaven where they meet somebody whose job or whose desire is to convince them to stay. And one of the people who comes is a painter. And the person who is there to convince them to stay talks about, at this point in hell and what's gotten you there is about reputation and style. But what you first fell in love with was the way the light shone in the world. That's what drew you to do painting in the first place. And the person from heaven really wants this artist who's in hell to remember that and to find that. I think that's one of the stories where the painter goes back, where if there's no progress forward or none of the mind of the arts, he leaves. I want our conversations to have people hang up with I saw how the light bounced off of my world today. And to me, that's pretty cool. And if a person then can hear the light from one person, maybe they go into their world looking for it. That's what I want this to be.
See, your word pictures on that, like, it's just, I would be like, we're going to encourage people by telling stories. And you're like, nah, there's the light. If you can't tell, Pete and I are wired differently. In a good way, though. I don't know. I'm just reminded. Do you remember the movie Elf, where you bring us down a whole octave, and the guy's like, "But in a good way." Yeah, that's what I just heard. In a good way. All right. So, who ideally? We obviously don't have names. Not obviously, but we don't have names of people lined up. We're looking for folks to come on. Who would be the ideal people to come in, and why? Like, for what can people expect coming forward? Like, what are we doing on the podcast that's differentiating? That's the other part.
Well, I think when I think about a good memoir candidate, if it's a person who says, I've got a great story and I should have a book, they're almost always wrong. If they're saying, I'm willing to do this because my kids are asking me to, that's a good start. There's also always the challenge of when it's a couple where the wife has dealt with the husband, being a zealous person. Anyway, sometimes wives don't want to muck up water that has finally settled to clear it. But anyway, what I don't want podcast interviews that are about people pimping themselves, thinking that their stories are great. I want people who are willing to share their story because they're seeing God do something, or there's some glimmer of the light, and they're willing to talk about that, or there's a payoff. Like, I'd be interested in talking to people who give. So I took my daughter to YWAM Baja in October and had a great experience with her. And I met a bunch of people at this President's Build who have been coming for years and giving to this thing. And what I found is I didn't have any kind of line of sight to the amount that I said I wanted to try to give over the next 2 years. But when I chose the number, I'd never had a business goal based off of a giving goal before. And it changed. It makes it easier for me to ask for the business or for the dollar amount, because I'm trying to hit a mark over here. It's not about my value prop. It's about my purpose. I would like to hear from people who have things they're giving to, and that giving inspires how they do the business they do, or the way that they treat their employees, especially if the company can be overtly Christian, but doesn't require somebody to wear the T-shirt to receive the love. That's a good thing. So how do you love that paralyzed servant without requiring them to come to Jesus? Let Jesus be lifted up, and let Jesus draw people to himself. That's who I want to talk to. And I think there are a lot of people who are like that. But the ones who end up, I think the more you tell your private story, your personal story casually, the more it can lose some of its magic. And so I don't want people to tell their story because it becomes their shtick. I want it to be, here's what I'm experiencing with God, and
Yeah.
and it's in media res. It's in the middle of things, and cool. And I think there are people who will respond to that.
So are we going to edit afterwards? I don't know if we're going to edit afterwards, but I want to dig in on the Baja deal. Why you've obviously done the generosity thing, known about tithe and all those pieces before. What was the change in regards to Baja? And then there's even a story you told me previously about a couple of individuals within there. I want to tease that out a little bit more. Why Baja? What changed? What was the difference? What drew you to increase the giving there?
Well, what I was just watching and being distracted by was a heron just flew by, and it was being hounded by two little black birds. It's the same one I'd seen yesterday. The giving's not the point. The giving is a layer of invitation. I feel like God was inviting me to an adventure, and that in inviting me to the adventure, part of it is he's going to make promises, and there's going to be drama, and there are going to be moments where he comes through, and then in the coming through, there's also
Like you like thumbing up the camera. What can I say?
I think there's an invitation to let him show off. A year before the Baja trip, so a year and a half ago now, a little bit more than a year and a half, I had a dream, and in this dream, I'm standing in a fallow field, yelling the name of Jesus to the four winds, as one does. To the east of me, across a road, was another field that was flourishing like a hobby farm would. That was our previous world. That was old business, all that sort of stuff. But now I'm in this fallow field that's defined by declaring the name of Jesus. I see the kids pass through these trees to the west and a break in the trees. I follow them in the dream, and we walk out onto this Mexican seaside village. And at first, I can't find the kids, and so there's a moment of fear in there. And I'm not sure how this translates into the future, but I'm feeling very aware of when the fear happens. It's already been promised. I do find the kids, and then adjacent to this village is an estate similar to the Robin Masters estate on Magnum PI. So it's some sort of combo of Mexico and Hawaii. And I'm aware that third place is the place from which the kids will set sail to anywhere in the world, because you're on the ocean. Well, I let that dream. I mean, it was a weird dream. I woke up like I'm yelling the name of Jesus to the winds. What's this? The day after Pentecost last year, I started seeing herons every day, and I was probably 13 days into it. I'm driving with my wife, and I comment, I've seen herons the last 13 days. And she says, well,
Yeah.
what does that mean? And I said, I don't know. And she's, well, dummy, when was the last time you saw herons 13 days in a row? Why don't you pray about it? And so I pray, and God brings me back to that dream. And he says, the heron is the closest thing to a seabird you've got in Indianapolis. And so that heron is to remind you to pour yourself in to the second field, because I'm taking you to the third field, or to that third destination. Well, I ended up seeing herons every day the rest of the summer, until it was I believe it was my birthday, August 2nd, that I had decided I couldn't swing the money and the time to take Mira to this Mexico build. And I had texted somebody about it, and I didn't see a heron on my birthday. And I'm like, this sense of disobedience and like repentance. I'm like, all right, we're going. And then I started seeing herons again. Well, I hadn't drawn the connections until we get to Mexico, and we're on the YWAM base overlooking the ocean. And I'm seeing my daughter totally come alive in this setting. Both kids respond to settings that are, Henry, my younger, refers to them as gaudy. If it's a gaudy setting, Henry comes alive. Both of them do. But Mira, on the build, no breaks, worked super hard. She had insights, and then these connections. One of the guys who has been going for years and years, I look over it's this old man, and I'm seeing my daughter hugging this old guy, and like, curious. And I get a moment with him, like, how did you and Mira connect? And I'm kind of thinking, like, I'm wondering, what kind of grandpa are you in some ways,
Right.
and he's like, I don't know. I shared a story, and Mira hugged me, and they had this super connection. And so the story was, he talked about some time where he'd taken a van full of kids with paint rollers over to a different build site, and they'd had a paint fight. And Mira
Yeah.
just knew everything she needed to know about this guy. Well, I something just clicked, that there was this adventure, and that the herons and this sense of promise and this third place existed there. And whether it ends up being YWAM specific, and YWAM Baja or Kono is the other big facility they have, I don't know. But in that environment, and I'm recognizing that things like YWAM are a context for relationships. I think you can give to the organization, or you can give to the relationships that happen within the organization, or you can give to people who are in, like, the missionaries who are doing this stuff. There are different ways to connect there. But what I saw was a path for my family. And so something clicked in. He, yeah. So the heron just now, all spring, there are specific things that I think are going to be breakthroughs that I'm excited. Like, these are more related to the JesusDoes nonprofit that I started around capturing stories. But I'm in this waiting time. I have the vision. I've had the vision that I think is about to pop. I've had for 30 years this summer, and the anguish of waiting for it is nuts. But every day there's a heron, and I think we'll see if I can lay in. I'll tell you the story, and we'll see if we can capture the video I sent you a couple nights ago. But
Yeah.
I had this sense that a heron was going to fly over my house, and I set up a chair on the back porch, and there was a dove sitting on the power line in the alley behind the house, and I'm like, Holy Spirit sitting there. And I'm like, all right, I will sit here and wait for this heron, camera in hand, ready to record in slow-mo, until that dove flies away. And if it flies away, I'll go inside. Well, 90 minutes later, a heron flew right over my head, and I recorded it. And it was this sense of, there's still promise. And so, boy, if you will follow, I'm wanting to get you to this third place. And I know how hard it is, and I know how frustrating it is. And I feel like God can't be any more overt about this sense of, like, it's every day. And sometimes a couple of days ago it was 5 herons. And then they've been flying directly over the window I'm sitting in front of here in my office. Yesterday and today, the same heron flew by. Yesterday it went right over the window, and today it went sideways. There were 2 little black birds harassing it. Like, oh, that's fear, doubt. That's frustration about money. And it's like, spiritual skits for dummies kind of performance on this stuff. But anyway, the heron flew over the house, and then as soon as I stood up after recording it, I heard the dove kind of coo as it took off to fly away. And so the Spirit sat with me until the heron flew over. And we'll show the video. You can make of it what you want. There's something about Baja and the giving that I think is live. And so I mentioned the first tithe before. The third tithe is it's Deuteronomy 14, 28, and 29. And it comes right. So there are 3 tithes. The first one is for the Levites, and that's the whose we are. The next is about the festivals and feasts. That's in Deuteronomy 12 and 20 and 14. And that's the who we are as a people. And then the third tithe is the one, another 10% every 3 years, which I think is fascinating because if you tithe, if this only happens every 3 years, you can't have a perpetual welfare state. It's a different sort of, it's a pulse. But it's the who we are to the world. And so Deuteronomy 14:29, at the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, and so now we get the priests associated with the least of these, kind of Jesus style, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your walls shall come and eat and be filled. And then here's kind of the promise that comes with it. And it's the only one of these tithes that comes with a promise, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. I think that there is a sense within that tithe of who we are to the world, and maybe this connects to Baha, that when we are giving to the world, to the least of these, something about that completes our presence in the world and back to God spreading goodness and all that sort of thing, that he will bless the work of our hands as we give in that particular way. The other two are whose we are. There's no reward for that. That's his claim. And then the who we are, the reward is the festival and is the belonging. But the who we are to the world seems to have a payoff against the work we do. And I find that to be part of the invitation within the heron, within the giving, and that's me scratching at it. And again, I do the too long version of it, but I think we're going to talk to plenty of people who give and have a simpler way of saying it, but they're pointing to the same truth, and that truth will be, as I give, God blesses the work of my hands, and therefore, maybe part of what I should do with the work of my hands is make sure that I'm giving. And then I'm doing that in a way that invites God to keep and make promises that I trust.
Well, I think that's the show. So looking ahead, we're not sure yet who the guests will be on, but we'll be probably more in the king category than the prophet or priest, although we might surprise you. There will be stories to hopefully inspire you, encourage you, have you go, I'm not the only one. We're obviously pretty Jesus-y in how we come across. We like talking about the things that matter most in kingdom. How do we spread the gospel? But related to stories that we hope you find inspiring. Anything else to add to that? Or we want to wrap?
No, I think that's good. Hanging up, I'm having self-consciousness about the length of this. I made a point of letting myself go along or be the focus today. In the work I do and in the conversations,
I kind of had to strong arm him into it, but whatever. He did.
Well, we did have to talk about doing it on purpose. I think that what God's great at doing is celebrating his people in ways that ends up glorifying him. But his delight is we exist because he thought it'd be awesome to know us and see us. And I want the conversations we have. You don't have to come in theologically loaded for bear. You don't have to come in. There's just this. I guarantee that if you've invited Jesus in, the beautiful thing already exists there, and that we can show you that glint. So that's my hope. So
all right,
that's that.
We'll catch you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Todd.
That's fun, dude.
Thanks.